Welcome to Janus Corporation's Hazard Communication Training Part 2. In Part 1, we discussed the potentially hazardous materials that Janus typically uses on many of our projects. We discussed safety data sheets where we get information about the hazards within those materials and how to protect ourselves best from those hazards. We discussed warning pictograms used by the globally harmonized system and how they indicate what types of hazards exist within each material. We discussed the symptoms of exposure to the various hazards within the products Janus typically uses, and we discussed what to do if you start to suffer from any of those symptoms. Basically, tell the supervisor what you're feeling and get out of containment. Today, we're going to discuss additional hazardous materials Janus disturbs on projects, asbestos, lead, those types of things. The requirement for Janus to notify other contractors and building occupants of the materials we're using or disturbing. We'll also look at a complete chart of all the warning pictograms used by the globally harmonized system. We will also go over fire protection labels that products are labeled with, either on the SDS sheet or both on the SDS sheet and on the container of the product as well. This is a list of a few of the materials that Janus often disturbs on many of our projects. Asbestos, heavy metals, usually lead, but it could be mercury, beryllium, other types of heavy metals in various products, paints, rubberized flooring, various other things. Concrete, which could have silica and hexavalent chromium in it. PCBs, which are chemicals often found in mastics and putties, window caulkings, sealants, and other products. Mold, which we deal with, often mold growing in asbestos or lead-containing materials. And silica. Now, above we talked about silica being in concrete, but silica can be in drywall, can be in plaster, can be in 2x4 ceiling tiles, and numerous other products. Janus employees receive training on how to protect themselves from these materials. However, if others are working in our area, we must assure they understand the hazards that exist and have training on how to protect themselves from those hazards. Janus doesn't typically work in the same workspace as other contractors, most often working within a sealed and signage protected work area, our containment. In the event Janus must work with other contractors in the same space within our containment, Janus requires other contractors to take training specific to the existing hazards, including activities they can and cannot legally and safely perform, what personal protective equipment they must wear, including respirators, the health hazards presented by unprotected exposure to the existing hazards within the regulated area or the containment, and other CalOSHA required discussion topics. Janus often provides this training to the other contractors when necessary to assure they understand the hazards involved and how to protect themselves from those hazards. Janus will also document with an entry-exit log exactly who has entered the regulated area, be they a Janus employee or an employee of another employer. For Janus employees and for others in our work area, when potentially hazardous materials are placed in a container other than the original container, this is a product that we're using, the new container must be labeled. This includes squirt bottles, buckets, jars, and other containers. For instance, mastic removal fluid in a squirt bottle for detail work. Rather than carrying around a full bucket of mastic removal fluid, that bottle is supposed to be labeled as mastic removal fluid. It does not require it to have all of the hazard communication labels on it, but it must be labeled as to what it is. No unlabeled containers. The globally harmonized product labels. Now these you'll find on the product itself, the product container itself. These provide information on the products and the hazard grouping that the products fall into. Health hazard. The picture looks like a man with a starfish on his chest. Could be carcinogenic, means it causes cancer. Mutagenic, which means that it changes your DNA. Reproductive toxicity, which means it may be harmful to unborn children. A respiratory sensitizer, which means if you breathe it in, it could cause problems with your ability to breathe. Could have a target organ toxicity, which means like asbestos, that tends to cause problems in our lungs. The flame, picture of a flame, that's pretty self-explanatory there, things that can burn. An exclamation mark. This one means that the product is an irritant to the skin, could sensitize the skin, which means it could make the skin feel numb. It could be acutely toxic, which means harmful, could absorb through the skin. Narcotic effects, which means it could make your thinking altered or it could make you sleepy. respiratory tract irritant, which means that it could be a problem for you breathing. A gas cylinder means that the cylinder is under pressure. You don't want to drop it. If it is punctured or the valve at the top is broken, it could become a torpedo. Corrosive, basically acid, cause skin damage, eye damage. It could also be damaging to metals. Exploding bomb, that means things will blow up. Flame over a circle, that's an oxidizer. And oxidizers are chemicals that when they become involved in a fire, they accelerate the fire. The fire burns hotter and spreads faster. Chemicals that are a hazard to the environment show the tree and the fish, and I guess that's a river underneath it. And then the skull and crossbones, if there is a skull and crossbones label on the chemical that you're using, you definitely want to be protected. That means acutely toxic or fatal. National Fire Protection Association labels. This label serves to warn workers and firefighters of the hazards materials can present during an emergency, a spill, or a fire. This chart is most often found on the SDS sheet, almost always, and it can be found sometimes on the material container itself, though not always. These are various products with fire warning labels on them. We're not going to go through each of these with the intent of trying to get somebody to memorize them. The rating numbers, the higher the number, the more hazardous the material is going to be during a fire. The white is a special rating. Sometimes the white diamond is left blank. If it's oxidizing, remember an oxidizing agent will help spread a fire, will make it hotter and spread faster. SA, simple asphyxiants. Asphyxiants are something that will suffocate you. And the bottom one, the W with a line through it, means it reacts violently or explosively with water. Easiest one to explain with that, if you have a grease fire on your stove, you do not want to throw a glass of water on it because that will explode and it could spray you with burning oil or it could explode and spread the fire. These also come in Spanish. If you would like one, let us know. We can get these to you. Things you should know. Janus Corporation's Injury and Illness Protection Program contains Janus Hazard Communication Program, which is a more detailed version of the video training that you've just taken. It includes both Part 1 and Part 2. This IIPP, or Injury and Illness Protection Program, is available in each Janus office. Remember, if you start to suffer from the symptoms of exposure to any of the potentially hazardous materials being used on a project, you should inform your supervisor and exit the work area as soon as possible. One of the things that you should have been taught in your initial asbestos classes is that most potentially hazardous materials like asbestos have a long-term health effect, 10 to 40 years before the first symptoms show up. Therefore, you should protect yourself from even short-term, low-level exposures by using the proper work practices and personal protective gear, including respiratory protection, even if you're not doing something that is a high-level exposure issue for you now. Small exposures over a long period of time are just as hazardous to you as a short-term, high-level exposure. Thank you for taking Janus Corporation's Hazard Communication Training Part 2. Please proceed to the quiz.